Hey guys, what's up? Today I'm going to show you how to make a totally self-standing workbench that has a bunch of additional storage above, below, and even some pegboard space. I was looking around for some designs for new workbenches that would have a sort of above shelf, but I wasn't able to find anything that was freestanding, so I decided to design my own, so I'm going to show you how to build one of these today if you're interested. I'll also drop a list of all the hardware that I used in case you want to build your own. I did spend about $150 on this. It came out pretty good, and I don't think you can really beat it for the price compared to some pre-bought workbenches. However, there's definitely some areas you can cheapen it up if you wanted to aim for a slightly lower budget build. So that plywood is still out in the garage. I need to cut it down to size so that it will fit down here, but I'm going to start by cutting the legs down to size. Now, I did buy all this from Home Depot, so if you're going to do that, just make sure that, especially with the 2x4s, they're in good condition and are pretty straight. A lot of them are pretty warped, but I was able to find a decent number of good sized ones, and they were cheap enough that it makes this whole project relatively affordable. So I got my 6 legs cut down to 29¼ inches each. I want the table to be 30 inches tall, so with the 3¼ inch plywood that adds up. So now I need to cut down a couple of these 2x4s. Unfortunately, they didn't have any 8-foot sections. They had 104 and just under 8 feet. I think it was like 92 or something. I forgot what the standard size is. So I had to cut them down to the 8-foot length, and now I'm going to measure it out. So I have the 4 legs on each side, and then I gotta measure it out and mark for 2 in the center. And then I'm going to make the top and bottom, so the 2 halves of the frame, really. So now you can sort of see what I'm going for here. I got the 3 4x4s as the legs. I got the upper part, which will mate with the top of the workbench, and then I got a lower section there, which I just put about 4 inches off the ground to put for a lower shelf, and then I'll attach the upper shelf after I'm done building the frame. Right now, it's really just important to make sure everything's level, so use a square or a scrap piece of wood or what have you just to make sure that your ends are all as square as possible, so that way your workbench will be nice and firm and won't wiggle around. So especially with wood like this, where it's, not the best quality wood, it's not the worst quality wood, but it can definitely be warped over a section of 8 feet or so. So besides making sure that you have fairly straight sections to begin with, there will always be a little bit of inconsistency. So you got to make sure that your ends are all as square as possible. From here now, I'm going to duplicate this exactly on the other side, and then I will make some intermediate fasteners to join the 2 halves together, and that will pretty much be the main structure for the table section. So now that I've got both sides of the table sort of framed out, the last piece for the main table section is the cross bracing. Now, you can really make it however wide you want. I'm going to aim for about 28 inches. So I'm going to take 28, subtract 2 times the thickness of the 2x4s that make the outer surfaces over here, and then cut 8 pieces of that length. So that will go on the top and bottom along each section of the 2x4. One quick other consideration, if you're following along, you can make the table however wide you want, like I mentioned, but I'm going to be using the other section of the 4x8 sheet of plywood as the shelf. So with 28 inches for the main body, that leaves me with 20 inches for the shelf, which I think is a pretty reasonable number. So that's sort of something you should consider if you plan on changing that at all. So I just got my cross-sectional pieces cut. They came out pretty darn well. Now, one tip I have for you guys is you could flip the table over, so that way they'll all be sort of flat when you put them together, just so that your table surface is probably what you want to be the most level. So I flipped it over so that way when I put in these pieces, they'll all sort of be as flat as possible, because when we put the table top on soon, we really want that to be as smooth of a process as possible. We don't have to worry about any bumps in the table. So here now you can see the whole table is pretty much framed out, at least the main section. We'll go over the external shelf option later on. However, it's now time for me to cut the sheet of plywood down to the final size for the table. So I'm just going to double check my width now that it's fully assembled to confirm that it's still around the same. If not, I can make a little adjustment so that it fits perfectly, and then we will put that on and continue. So in the case of cutting the main table, like I mentioned, I'm going to be using one spot for the table surface and another for a sort of half shelf above it. So I measured out the 28 inches that I needed, and then I also put a line at 29 inches because there is a 1-inch guard on that circular saw. Don't have a table saw to do this with, so I had to get a little creative. I ended up putting, like I mentioned, a mark at the 28 inch that I want, and then a 29 inch one to account for the inch of the guard. I clamped a pretty straight 2x4 section going the length, and that'll act as my guide so I can run the circular saw down there and get a pretty straight cut. Luckily, I only need to do one cut, so I can put the cut section on the back of the table, even if it's not perfectly straight, but this should get me pretty darn close. I forgot to mention this, but I propped up the piece on some 4x4 scraps just so that the saw wouldn't come in contact with the ground while cutting. So at this point, the tabletop is now cut. I have secured it with these 1.5-inch screws to just make sure it's nice and sturdy. Did that every 2 feet or so, just to make sure that it would come loose. With this second piece, I'm going to make a shelf that sits kind of above. I'm thinking about 3 feet from the surface of the table to the bottom of the shelf, just to give me clearance for things like my tabletop drill press and bandsaw. I'm going to make sure that there's no extra things that might stick up a little higher than that. But after that, I can sort of frame out some extra legs to stand up and a small frame similar to that of the top of the table for under there, and I could put it all together. So after double checking the measurement of the shelf, I cut some new sections to make a small frame, which will go on the bottom of the shelf. We'll attach it just like we attached the top of the workbench to the frame. Now, I did 2 of each of these cross sections out of a piece of wood, and it just so happens that that's about the height I need for the bottom of the shelf to be where I want it, so it worked out really well, and I'm not really wasting any wood this way. So I'm going to put those on there, cut 2 more to that length, and then that'll make a basic frame which I can attach to the outside of the workbench. This should technically be sort of self-supporting, but once we lock it into the workbench, it'll be rock solid. So I just made this sort of C-shaped backsplash piece to go along the edge of the shelf. I'm going to flip it upside down and attach the 4 legs you see back here to it, and then when I flip it back right side up, it should be standing sort of on its own above this workbench, and then I'm going to push it into place and lock it in with some screws. This is the shelf fully assembled with the 4 legs and the backsplash in the main part of the shelf. Now, I built it backwards, so when I flip it over, it'll be in the correct position. Then I just have to secure it to the side of the workbench and make sure that it's sturdy. Okay, so we are nearing completion with the full workbench. Now, I added a backsplash with an 8-foot 2x4 along that back there, so that way the things won't fall behind it. And then I flipped this over, obviously, and secured it pretty firmly on the back side. But then for this other side, I had to make a little bit of a wedge. It ended up being about 3.5 inches for me. It might vary for you, but I just took scrap and did that, and then secured it with a couple screws on both sides, and the top and the bottom. So I did decide to throw some pegboard up. To accomplish that, I put 2 8-foot 2x4s in between those posts at the top and bottom of where the pegboard is, and then I just screwed it into that. I think it really sort of completes the look and makes it feel like a total self-enclosed workspace where I can hang some tools on the back. And then also I did put 2 more 2x4s down on the bottom to sort of finish off the shelving area down there for additional storage. So just a little bit closer look, you can see the 4 2x4s there. You could probably gap it a little more if you were only going to use things like bins. However, just to make it versatile and so that I could put whatever down there, I put in the 4th one, just so that way the spacing wasn't too bad. Now, I already have workshop lighting. I might add an additional strip above this just to make it a bit brighter, but if you wanted to put something like a LED strip or add some kind of lighting to the underside of here, it might not be a bad idea. I'm a big fan, too, of the gap at the bottom of the pegboard like that. This is a 2x4 foot section. It fits in perfectly if you use 2 of them. And then it leaves a small gap so you can run things like wiring through that for any of the tools that you might need. You can put a power strip on the back, and that way it won't take up workbench space, but then you can still have the ability to run wires in a pretty direct manner. Additionally, I did sand around all the edges just with a sanding block to make sure that I got any burrs from any of the cutting process to make sure I wouldn't get splinters. That's pretty much going to wrap up this video for today, so if you enjoyed it or if you have any questions, please leave a comment down in the comment section. I'll do my best to answer. As always, guys, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another video.